Their leader, Jesus of Nazareth, had just been executed. "12 men in fear for their lives. And there was no place to hide. Yet these terrified men became the founders of a worldwide faith. So how do 12 regular folks from the backwoods of Galilee become these giants of history? The disciples. The disciples spread Jesus' message across the ancient world. Many of them sacrificed their lives for it. The transformation of this tiny, threatened group into a world religion is a phenomenal story. But to understand it, we need to trace their journey from the very beginning. The disciples grew up in a land ripped apart by turmoil. As the first century dawns in Galilee, Jesus and the disciples are still just children when a band of men protesting about rising taxes and Roman rule stage an uprising in the key city of Sepphoris.
The Romans immediately put down the revolt with complete destruction of the city and killed all the inhabitants or sold them as slaves. And it must be a memory which the locals kept for generations.
It's no surprise then that Galilee was a hotbed of rebellion during the first century. Helen Bond has studied this social and historical background to the Bible.
You know, there were quite a lot of bandit leaders at about the time of Jesus. We hear of people taking to the hills and going and living in caves, and where other people came to them and they led resistance movements against the Romans.
The disciples grew up against this background. Some may even have witnessed the Sepphoris rebellion. Perhaps in Jesus they saw a leader who could free them from the Romans. Now, scientific and historical breakthroughs are giving us new insights into the lives of the disciples. The picture that's emerging of these 12 men is both vivid and surprising. One thing's clear from the outset. They came to Jesus for a set of very different reasons and with very different hopes. By the time the disciples were in their 20s, the first of those reasons may have been financial. Hefty taxes would have been a constant concern for the 4 disciples who worked as fishermen. James, brothers Peter and Andrew, and John.
We know that James and John, Peter and Andrew were in a partnership from the Gospels, from Luke. So they are under a lot of pressure to catch the fish in order that they meet their obligations, both to feed the families and to pay the tax collector.
The fishermen were forced into a contract with the tax collector to hand over their catch, including fresh fish like carp and sardines, in return for inferior, salted fish. It was an unfair exchange bound to breed resentment.
All of the fish have been counted from the catch, and the agents of the tax collector come and take that away to go to some of the tables of the rich people in the city.
This amounted to enormous financial pressure. People longed for more control over their lives. They were looking for a leader to help them fight back. Maybe they thought that leader was Jesus.
The initial followers of Jesus were attracted to something very practical that dealt with daily life, that dealt with real issues. We would misconstrue it to call it a purely religious movement.
While some of the disciples may have joined the Jesus movement to challenge taxes, it doesn't explain why all 12 joined. In particular, it doesn't explain Matthew. Before Matthew became a disciple, he was a tax collector.
We know about Matthew's job from the Gospels, but they don't tell us why he was attracted to Jesus. For one thing, unlike the fishermen, Matthew lived the comfortable life of a wealthy man. James Strange is an archaeologist whose excavations of ancient villages have helped to paint a picture of life in the first century.
People who lived in any village in the Galilee, their houses from the outside would look absolutely identical. The only way you could have a luxury good would be inside the house. You might plaster a room very finely and paint it very nicely, but that's only for those inside the house. No one outside would have any idea unless they were invited in.
The inside of Matthew's house would have shown that he was far wealthier than his neighbors.
If Matthew were a low-level tax official and only had a few villages assigned to him, he would still be richer than anybody else in any of those villages.
But his wealth would have made Matthew a hated figure in his community. This could have been the impetus for him to join Jesus.
He would be really utterly alone. I mean, it would be very difficult for him to find people to have just ordinary socializing with. He'd be in a very precarious position. And I imagine, to tell you the truth, that he would probably also have to have bodyguards.
When he joined the Jesus movement, Matthew turned his back on tax collecting and was welcomed, maybe for the first time, into a community. But perhaps the most puzzling disciple is also one of the most famous, Judas Iscariot. He's more of an enigma than Matthew. Judas has a bad reputation, untrustworthy and disloyal. But he was the disciples' treasurer, looking after donations to the group and organizing provisions.
So here you have this band of disciples. They're living out of some kind of a common fund. And he apparently is the bursar. He handles all the accounts, keeps track of what we need. A quartermaster, if you... I think it involves some organizational ability, some trustworthiness, some leadership.
So, far from being the bad boy, when Judas joined the Jesus movement, he must have been regarded as one of the most reliable members. Unfortunately, we know very little about the remaining disciples. There's Thomas and Philip, who's said to come from the same area as the fishermen. There's a Bartholomew and a Simon, known as the Zealot, probably because he was zealous about upholding Jewish religious law. But there's a controversial theory that Simon, along with Jude and another disciple called James, were actually Jesus' brothers. They may have been stepbrothers rather than blood relatives. Nevertheless, some experts believe that they were part of Jesus' family. Whatever the blood ties between Jesus and some of his disciples, it's clear that these 12 men are very different from one another. Such variety might make an interesting group, but you'd think a radical movement such as this would need like-minded recruits. Kerry Cooper specializes in group psychology. We asked him to apply modern psychological principles to what we know about the disciples, to find out how hard it would be for such a group to work together and become founders of a new faith.
When I look at the disciples, I would have thought, as a psychologist, if I was just looking at the group being composed, I'd say disaster area. Coming from totally different kind of backgrounds, a tax collector, people who are revolted by the taxes, a zealot, all sorts of different characters, very different. Now, if they had a leader that could kind of resolve their differences and the potential conflicts that are going to come on board, and got them to think about what the ultimate objective is and how that objective could meet their own personal needs, then it would work.
These 12 men, from such diverse backgrounds, did have a strong leader in Jesus, and they had a mission. They may have been prepared to give working together a chance if it meant they would see some action against the Romans. But there's evidence that traveling together as a group may have been a harsh enough experience in the first century to put these very different personalities to the test. The 12 men we know as the disciples were a very mixed group, united behind a strong, charismatic leader. But following Jesus was never going to be easy. Their fragile unity was about to face a tough test. Whatever their motives for joining this strange new movement, the disciples soon realized that life on the road with Jesus could be unpredictable and dangerous. Galilee is about 35 miles across. The disciples could walk it in a day or so. But the terrain can be rugged. In these places, there is little protection from the elements or from robbers.
Well, life on the road is quite hard, actually. There are people who regard that as their territory sometimes, and they don't like you coming through. There are wild animals you have to think about. In the ancient world, actually lions and bears were the two prime predators you had to think of.
As if life on the road wasn't dangerous enough, the Bible records that Jesus told the disciples to leave their possessions behind. Even so, there are some basics that experts believe they would have needed.
For example, in very bad weather, you really need a wool mantle like this to dress yourself in. You can wrap it tightly about yourself and sleep in it like a tent. You can also use it as a raincoat because it is impervious to water. If someone is not friendly and has not given you fire, you have to have a way to make fire. You'll need a piece of iron and a piece of flint and a scorched piece of linen so that you can nap your own fire. Otherwise, you're in a terrible position. Now, in terms of security, you might need to defend yourself from wild animals, from predators. Here is a sword. It's rather small, but you get the idea. When Jesus is arrested, two of the disciples have swords. You can put this then on a belt around your thigh underneath your clothing.
If the disciples did leave everything behind to follow Jesus, even something as fundamental as finding food could be a problem. There's a clue in the Bible as to how they fed themselves. In one story, they are said to take grain from a field. This may sound as though they turned into thieves, but not so. Jewish law made provision for the poor, including travelers.
If you have a field, because you're a landowner, and you're harvesting the field, you have to leave bits with the sort of the corner of the field untouched so that the poor can come and collect from it.
When they traveled, the disciples left behind more than their livelihoods. Many had other responsibilities.
Most of the disciples seem to have been married. We certainly know that Peter was married. And I think it would have been very difficult for his wife and children left behind. The disciples were the people who brought in the money. They were the ones who caught the fish or who worked on the land. And I think it would have left the families in very, very difficult circumstances.
However, we may be wrong to assume that once they left, they never returned. The disciples and Jesus may have gone home at night.
We do have the story of Peter, who's called by Jesus. He leaves everything, and then only a few verses later, he's going to have tea with his mother-in-law. And so that gives the impression that maybe the break, at least in the early period when Jesus' ministry was located in Galilee, maybe the break wasn't quite so clear-cut as we're often led to believe.
On these journeys, they really did have to rely on the hospitality of strangers. But it's a little-known fact that the disciples had something to offer in return. Something that was much sought after and rarely available.
When we dig up tombs, most people in the tombs in their 40s and 50s when they die. And the mortality rates look like they do for third world nations today. Because after all, a very ordinary infection could simply kill you because they had no way to deal with that.
There was no formal health system in first century Galilee. Villagers relied on local healers who had developed home cures that seemed to work. Jesus had a big reputation as a healer, but so too did his disciples.
If they went to a village, they seemed to have two main tasks. One was to announce the kingdom of God was upon you. The other was to heal the sick. And if they successfully healed the sick, then they could have their daily bread. They might have a place to lay their heads.
Faith healing has a long history. For centuries, it was the only healing people knew. Now, modern medicine may be able to explain how it can work.
A little low and a little medial, so we need to go higher and lateral.
Surgeon Bruce Mosley treats patients with arthritic knee pain. In a recent experiment, he treated 3 different groups. All patients were taken down to the operating room and had incisions made in the knee. But only the first group received routine surgery. The second group had a smaller operation, and the third had no treatment at all. The results of the experiment were quite unexpected.
They all improved. They all got benefit from the surgery. They all reported less pain. They all reported improved function, and they were all very satisfied. But interestingly, the pretend surgery group did just as well as the real surgery groups.
Physicians are now closer than ever to understanding how the placebo effect works.
I think the placebo works through a psychological or an emotional impact that a treatment has on a patient. And it ties into what the patient's expectations and beliefs are. If the patient expects and believes that a treatment's going to be effective, it almost certainly will. And now hands in front, up over your head as high as you can go. Okay.
And if people today can get better because they believe in the doctor's ability to heal them, maybe the same thing could have been happening back in the first century.
You get these changes.
Dr. Mosley still believes God was involved in the disciples' healing, but does not discount the importance of the patient's belief that they can be cured.
You can certainly draw parallels between what Jesus and the disciples were doing and what a doctor does today. In both situations, they have a belief that the healer is going to help them, and you could certainly imagine that some of the benefit that the ancient healers have had is from a placebo effect.
Slim. Slim. Slim.
But for all the good work the disciples did, healing could be a deeply frustrating experience. The Bible tells us sometimes they just couldn't do it.
In the Gospel of Matthew, there's a story of a man who brings his son to Jesus, and the son is exhibiting symptoms we would call epilepsy. And he complains the disciples had failed to heal his son. Well, Jesus does heal the son. Later on, the disciples come and say, well, why couldn't we do it? What was the problem? And Jesus says, it was your lack of faith.
The reference to the disciples' lack of faith is still true today. Physician Bruce Mosley believes that even now, the amount of confidence a doctor has in his treatment can affect the outcome.
If the surgeon has a high expectation and a faith that their treatment's going to have a benefit, then I believe that the patients can realize that. They can feel that. They can sense that. And the more confident the surgeon is, then I'm sure the more confident the patient is that that treatment's going to work.
But the disciples' occasional inability to heal may have been symptomatic of a more fundamental problem. To have complete faith in Jesus as a leader, the disciples needed to share his vision. All the evidence suggests that they did not always do so. Despite hardships on the road, the disciples stayed together, working in small teams and as a group. The movement was attracting larger and larger crowds, in no small part because of their ability to heal. All seemed to be going well, but beneath the surface there were still disagreements, even with Jesus. This becomes clear when Jesus tells his disciples to take their message to the Samaritans. Today, the word Samaritan describes a do-gooder. But to a first-century Jew, he was the enemy.
If Jesus told me we had to go through Samaria, my heart would sink. I would say, oh no, we've had hostility between us and the Samaritans for 500 years. And it doesn't look like it's going to get better.
The relationship between Jews and Samaritans was a very difficult one. It seems to have gone back to a problem over what was the proper site for the temple. The Samaritans said that the sacred site should be on their holy mountain, whereas the Jews said that the holy site should be in Jerusalem.
Samaritan villagers were not interested in what these Jewish preachers had to say, and they threw the disciples out. Instead of acting with humility, the disciples were furious. It was a flagrant breach of Jesus' teachings on loving your enemies. James and John were so angry they wanted to send down fire on the village and obliterate it.
Jesus says, no, that's not the way he works. He'll offer them salvation, but if they don't accept it, that's up to them. And he simply goes on to another place.
On more than one occasion, the Bible says they argue between themselves about which of them is the greatest. James and John even ask Jesus if they can have thrones next to his in the new kingdom.
I think this shows that there's a lot more competitiveness and rivalry between them than we often think. In many ways, this is only to be expected because first century society was full of squabbles over honour and shame and status. And so in this, the disciples are really just behaving like typical first century men.
These squabbles may have been typical, but according to psychologist Carey Cooper, they could escalate into damaging power struggles.
We have in almost all groups a James and a John. And the reason I say that is because they're a bit fiery, a bit revolutionary, but I think that they actually kind of want a leadership role. I think they're people who one has to manage quite carefully, otherwise their innate needs for leadership or to be in a position of influence or to be rebellious will get in the way.
The disciples managed to keep their differences in check most of the time. But on one occasion, these divisions threatened the very survival of the movement. A woman came in and poured expensive perfume over Jesus. The disciples were not impressed.
The disciples are annoyed that this woman has wasted this oil on Jesus. They say she should have taken it away, she should have sold it and given the money to the poor. But Jesus sees things quite differently. He says she's done a beautiful thing.
As treasurer of the group, Judas seems particularly upset by this act. Every group has disagreements, but the consequences of Judas' reaction were to be catastrophic. The Gospels of Mark and Matthew say Judas goes to the religious authorities to talk about leading them to Jesus. But for now, the other disciples appear to know nothing of Judas' actions. They are excited because after 3 years on the road, their leader has just made a momentous decision. Jesus was about to take his disciples to Jerusalem, the power base of the authorities. At last, they thought, we're about to see some action. They were in for a shock. The disciples entered Jerusalem with Jesus on what's become known as Palm Sunday. Jesus received a rapturous welcome, but it couldn't have come at a more politically sensitive time. Jerusalem was packed with pilgrims come to celebrate the festival of Passover, remembering how Moses had led their ancestors out of captivity in Egypt. According to James Charlesworth, a biblical scholar based in Jerusalem, Passover would have prompted the disciples to think about freedom and overthrowing the Romans.
It is a time of great excitement. The Jews are going to celebrate Passover. What does that mean? They are going to reenact and relive God's salvation of his people. So it's a very volatile time. It's a time when everybody is at the peak of excitement.
The highlight of the festival was a shared meal later that same week. But as they settled down to eat what has become known as the Last Supper, Jesus was unusually subdued.
Suddenly, in the midst of the meal, Jesus starts to talk about his death. He picks up the bread and says, "This is my body." He picks up the cup and says, "This is my blood." And he starts talking about doing things in remembrance of him. And I think the disciples must have wondered what on earth he was on about.
It's not clear why the disciples didn't understand what he was talking about. Perhaps all along they had just been waiting for some kind of uprising. The death of their leader was not part of the plan. But what happens next seals their fate. Judas sets off a chain of events that would lead to Jesus' crucifixion. He makes his fatal deal with the authorities. He agrees to betray Jesus. In return, he gets 30 pieces of silver.
If we're right that the piece of silver in question is the Roman and Greek denarius, then he's getting about 30 days' wages in silver. And that happens to be the price in some slave markets for a slave.
Not much for someone who would come to be worshipped as the Son of God. But Judas nonetheless accepts the money. He leads the guards to where he knows the group will be. Suddenly, everything they had worked towards begins to unravel.
The disciples are terror-struck. They don't know what to do. Peter's reaction was to draw his sword and to cut off the ear of the high priest's slave. And I think that's quite understandable. They really don't know what's happening. They don't know at that stage whether the arresting party are just going to arrest Jesus or whether they've come for them as well.
In fact, only Jesus is arrested. The disciples themselves scatter.
We have this single line in the Gospels: they all forsook him and fled. And I think we should see this on very human terms. It's nothing very theological or profound. They just got scared and they ran.
All the work of Jesus and the disciples undone by one man's act of treason. But some experts are not so sure that Judas was to blame. A new theory suggests that a fundamental mistake was made in translating the word betray, and that Judas did not in fact do this. In Greek, the word simply means to hand over. It does not have the more sinister implications of betrayal. Indeed, there's other evidence that Judas was not a traitor. Everyone, including the religious authorities, knew Jesus and where to find him.
What did he betray? Does he betray who Jesus is? Everybody knew who Jesus was. Did he betray where Jesus could be found? It makes the Gospels very clear that he goes to his customary place. So if we're not sure what he betrayed, how could he be called the betrayer?
Certainly, when Judas comes with guards to arrest Jesus, his greeting is strange for a traitor. A kiss.
Does a kiss suggest betrayal? In all our ancient sources, Philo, Josephus, and the New Testament, we hear that a kiss means a greeting or a farewell. There's no such thing as a kiss of betrayal.
What's convinced some experts that Judas didn't mean to betray Jesus is his response when he hears that Jesus is to be executed.
He throws the money back at the men. Obviously, something has gone wrong. He then is so disturbed, he goes out and he hangs himself.
But if Judas didn't want to betray Jesus, there still must have been a reason for his deal with the authorities.
I think one thing we could suggest is that he thought this would help Jesus, to have the audience with the high priest. This would help the man that could do miracles, even bring people back from the dead, to confront his enemies straight on and establish the kingdom that he so earnestly wanted to establish.
This is a controversial theory, and not everyone is convinced.
There's a certain attractiveness in that, I think, in that it makes what Judas has done more understandable. But I think that's very unlikely. All the Gospels suggest that Judas did betray Jesus for whatever reason, and we'll perhaps never know what that reason was.
Intentionally or not, the fact remains that Judas hastened the death of Jesus. If the disciples had any doubt that Jesus' arrest meant the end of the group, they must have been certain the next day. As their leader was crucified, it isn't clear where the disciples went.
They could have gone to a safe house where they had had the Last Supper. There seems to be some kind of a connection there when they rent that place or arrange for that place. But I think we have to assume that when they fled, they really fled. They wanted to stay out of danger.
The disciples were at their lowest ebb.
This is a critical stage because they've lost their leader. All groups need their leader, and particularly an inspirational leader like Jesus. Very, very critical. There is no real deputy, so that's a bit of a problem. So the group is likely to split up or have enormous difficulties.
And yet we know that these forlorn individuals founded what went on to become a major world faith. Clearly, something happened to change their fate. With their leader dead, the disciples were left utterly depressed and broken. At this point, the movement should have ended. But of course, the Jesus movement didn't collapse. So what held these frightened men together? Well, within days of Jesus' execution, there were stories of him rising from the dead. Is this what kept the disciples going?
All the disciples are together again in the upper room. They've got the doors firmly shut because they're worried about the Jewish authorities. And suddenly, Jesus appears in the room and says, "Peace be with you." This, I think, is a significant moment in the gospel story. I think the thing that really differentiates the Jesus movement from similar messianic movements in the first century is they're full of the conviction that their Messiah has survived death. And so this is a symbolic, empowering moment.
This belief that Jesus was still alive was one thing. But if the movement was to continue, they had to convince others that Jesus had risen from the dead. And that wasn't going to be easy. For this reason, many think another event was crucial for the survival of the movement. It's become known as Pentecost, and it took place several weeks after Jesus appeared to the disciples. It's this religious event that psychologist Carey Cooper believes transforms the group.
Pentecost, in my view, is the critical event for the group. And the reason it is because they don't have a leader. And the shared experience brings them together. It motivates them. It encourages to go out and preach and to convert people and to share their common experiences. It's a kind of surrogate leadership role.
Before Pentecost, the odds were stacked against the disciples. The different backgrounds, the infighting, and above all, the loss of their leader. It was a remarkable transformation. On the surface, it seemed to amount to nothing more than a psychological shift. But there may be more to it than that. There is now neurological evidence that religious experience causes a real and quantifiable change in the brain.
Get the vein for you to put the IV in. Okay, so we don't want you to bend your arm too much because it might, it could kink the catheter. Okay. I'm just gonna
Professor Andrew Newberg is a neuroscientist at Pennsylvania University. He's been studying the effects of such experiences on Buddhist monks and Catholic nuns.
We had them go through a practice such as meditation or prayer. And at the height of that practice, we would inject them through an intravenous line, a line that was in their vein, with a material that would allow us to measure the blood flow. At the time of the injection, it then is capturing a picture of what her brain is doing at the moment that she is in that heightened state of prayer. We can scan the brain sometime later to see what the snapshot is of what was going on in the brain during that particular practice.
The scan taken during prayer on the right is compared to that of a normal brain, said to be in its baseline state. It recorded a change in the part of the brain that helps us to sense everything around us. This area had less activity during prayer, which showed up as the color yellow. We are not so aware of our surroundings when activity in this part of the brain is reduced and our sense of ourself lessens. Instead, the mind begins to feel that it's at one with the whole universe. In fact, some people say that's when they become strongly aware of the presence of God.
The disciples must have undergone an incredible personal journey. At the beginning, they were just ordinary, humble fishermen, but by the end of the story, they become leaders of what eventually becomes a world religion.
The disciples didn't fit the conventional image of holy men. They were rough and flawed, susceptible to jealousy, bitterness, selfishness, even violence, just like the rest of us. Despite all of that, the movement they founded counts 1/3 of the world's population as its members, and their stories still inspire people today.